Keep in touch with the Wolf Connection Podcast on our Instagram handle at the Wolf Connection Pod, or email us your questions, comments, and guest ideas to podcast@wolfconnection.org. Thank you for your support, and howls to you all. Welcome to the Wolf Connection Podcast. I'm your host, John Kalfa. Another long-lost friend of the podcast who we haven't had on in quite some time, and she has been very, very busy doing a lot of things both personally and professionally. So if the intro takes a moment, it's because all of her titles have a million words. So here we go. From the top, she is the Carnivore Coexistence Consultant for the European Union, very important, Research Associate with the Center for Human Carnivore Coexistence for Colorado State University, and she is the Environmental Education Specialist for the Virginia Department of Conservation and Recreation. She is Cassi Camara. Cassi, so nice to see you again. How are you doing?
Oh my gosh. Really cool when I hear somebody else read out my titles. I'm like, wow, that's I sound awesome. But I'm also doing great. So I'm awesome. My titles are awesome. You guys are awesome. I'm excited to be back. Yeah.
I mean, just highlight some stuff for everybody who's listening of what you've been doing, because I saw you in DC for the Cry for the Wild rally, but it seems as though even leading up to that point, you were already, stuff was changing career-wise and you were in a lot of motion. So what's been going on? Just give everybody kind of a highlight reel of what's up.
Sure. In what capacity, right? So I would say in terms of work with the Center for Human Carnivore Coexistence, been working on some media analysis and research in terms of the wolf reintroduction in Colorado and doing some research around that. A lot of international travel this year. I think I've been to like 4 countries because I was very lucky to be signed on with a life project, which I know we'll talk about a little bit later on. And then I'm about 18 months into a new government job, working for the man. As an environmental education specialist. And I know we're going to talk more about that too. So all new things, and still trying to, get my wolf advocacy in there as well.
You made it.
I've done it.
You've done it. You've infiltrated every single solitary point of contact or anything.
Don't use the word infiltration. They'll tag this podcast.
That is true. Yeah.
Fire.
They're going to shut Steve and I down. That's what'll shut us down. The words. I really quick before we get into everything else, because you did mention Colorado, and I just want to hit this real fast, media-wise, because that was the first podcast we had with you, and it was truly informative, and you really got to the nitty-gritty of a lot of different things that people don't maybe see when you're talking about media consumption and what they see and the messaging they're getting. So with Colorado, real fast, what do you, from your perspective, if you zoom out, what are the things that are being said, and how is that working with both the reintroduction and coexistence methods that are going there? Because we are going to have another podcast later on in a month or so, sort of talking about a little bit more of reintroduction methods and what's working, what's not.
Yeah. So I think in the first one, I was really heavy. Had the wolves been reintroduced yet? They definitely had not. That was December of last year.
Correct.
Okay. So we were talking about the media in terms of what it looked like after the ballot initiative and the consumption, and really primarily what were the arguments that people both for and against the reintroduction were using in the media, and what that looked like, and if we could show any correlation between the actual vote to say, yes, we want wolves in Colorado, and what we were seeing in the media. Because the nature of a PhD and research, I'm still editing that same paper that we were talking about. But I can tell you the second part of actually my dissertation is looking at what happened post-vote. And we just finished some of that analysis. So sneak peek for everybody listening, we can definitely see that some of the same arguments were being used throughout, but the nuances within those started to shift, right? So no longer did it seem that people were, it's not a yes or no, this is going to happen. The rhetoric changed to, it might have still been negative or positive in nature, but how we're going to make this happen. And honestly, I think quite a bit of it shifted to, for lack of a better word, shitting on some of the local and state level government for making sure that they were going to consider this or consider that. And not bringing certain groups into the fold up into this. So there was a lot of procedural discussion happening in the media, which is not what was happening before the ballot. But because that is in its initial stages, I can really leave it there. And I think I will say, just from knowing people on all sides of that argument in Colorado, I do know that people on the inside of things are really trying. And I think we'll talk about the government a little bit later, but there is so much red tape that people have to work around to really do what the regular population wants to happen. And so that I just hope anybody who's listening from Colorado keeps that in the back of their mind of, if you don't see the things you care about happening in some of those spaces, don't necessarily assume that those people aren't caring about them or actively working to try and get that done, because oftentimes they are, but sometimes you won't see it for quite a while. I mean, the fact that we got wolves on the ground in 3 years from the vote, I mean, that is such a quick turnaround for something on that level. So stay tuned. Eventually I'll get something published and people can actually read it. In the meantime, you can shoot me an email, which I'm sure will be linked with something if you want to talk about the media more.
Have you had any major perspective shifts or opinion changes about this process since that last podcast, and now that the reintroduction has sort of kicked off, just about the approach and what works and what doesn't? Have you had any major personal shifts around it?
No, I mean, just to put it out there, I'm not sure I made a tons of friends in the conservation or wolf world with some of the things that I came out and said, because I do think that those who weren't in favor of reintroduction weren't brought to the table in a overwhelming capacity and weren't listened to. Because what we know so much in communication and conservation is it's not often the things that you say, but often it's just showing up and listening. And right. I think once the vote passed, there were some opportunities for people to be listened to. But no, I think on the whole, that is where so many of the things that I work on really try to focus on showing up and just hearing what people have to say. And I'm not sure that I don't believe that all of Colorado was listened to. And so I think that really degraded some trust from the get-go. And I think there are active efforts that are trying to repair that. But repairing broken trust is a lot harder than building it from the get-go. So I would say on a personal level, no. I still think those things. So if anybody wants to send me some hate mail, you can use the same email address.
It's coming.
Yeah. And I mean, what we know from all of that, right, is that the public trust, especially in these media outlets, especially in rural areas, really shaped the perception of this state government versus urban voters, and really was kind of a disconnection from realities faced from those rural communities. And I think that those implications had some ripple effects that we're going to see for years to come, honestly.
Yeah. I think this is what happens too when we have long form discussion too, is when we get to some of the things that, like you said, the intricacies of all these complicated processes, because again, anything political, anything with the government, there's just too many barriers and things to go through that, like you were saying, not everybody gets heard at the time that they think that it should happen. And so, we're just putting the information out of what we know and how we have heard it. So again, a lot of these things, that's why we try to have these long form discussions and get to all the stuff or most of the stuff that we have. And sometimes things are missed and it happens. So
and it's particularly hard with the wolf, right? Carnivores in general are difficult, but wolves have just become the symbol in some ways of the government overreaching their rights into your personal life. And so overcoming something like that, particularly if you're a government entity, that is a really difficult thing to try and figure out, particularly on a statewide level. So Colorado's got some work to do, but I do think things are going in the right direction there. And I think what people have to remember is those on both sides of this issue really believe in conservation. And there is actually common ground that we really forget exists.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think especially in Colorado. So what do you think needs to happen right now in Colorado or going forward that would address any of the concerns you mentioned and sort of advance this in an even better direction?
I mean, because it's me, and you know that I work in communications and outreach, I think education is going to be key with youth populations. So one of the things that we don't think about, and I say the general we, right? And this is for nonprofit organizations, public entities, governments. We think about solving a problem and we don't think about 10 or 20 years down the road. And the thing is, the people who voted wolves into Colorado are not going to be the people living with wolf populations in Colorado. So why are we not? And there are some efforts absolutely happening with youth and stuff in the state. But to me, that is a big area of focus, right? Your 60, 70, 80-year-olds, I am not saying you are invaluable as a person when you hear this, but you are not going to have to live with the either repercussions or the positive effects of this on the landscape. So working on what coexistence could look like with younger generations from Gen Z all the way down to Gen Alpha, to me, that is where a lot of the effort should be put in.
Right. That's a good segue, though, for the job I think you've been in for 18 months now, right? Cassi, the Virginia Department of Education and Virginia Department of Conservation and Recreation, mouthful. Describe, could you sort of describe a little bit about that, but just go into more detail about your work and why this is so important. This really, I feel, strikes a nerve for you, and you're so passionate about this area in particular when you talk about youth and you talk about conservation and making sure that the next generation or generations know this stuff. So as an environmental education specialist, what are the things that you're tasked with doing and bringing to the table for the next generation?
Yeah. So, I mean, let me give everybody like one sentence to say why I think it's so important, right? I like to look at generations in terms of communication because while it can make some really large overview statements, so to speak, or generalizations, generations have their own unique characteristics that were shaped by, very major social, technological, and economic forces during their time, which directly influences how they engage with the world, how they communicate, and how they make decisions. And so when you can start looking at people in those lenses, you can adapt your communication styles to your goals better, right? And so my work at the state level here in Virginia, so it's a really interesting office. So this office, it's a brand new Office of Environmental Education. It had existed about 8 years ago, but was disbanded. And so it was brought back actually by legislation. So I am legislatively mandated to exist, which means the government gets to tell me what to do, how much money I have, and things like that. And so part of my job specifically, I actually only work in K through 12 spaces. So I'm not working with adults in this capacity. I do work with teachers and things, but it's all through the lens of preparing tomorrow's youth. And so specifically what we're working on the state level, we get money to hand out grants to people. We develop resources. So one thing we're doing right now is developing an environmental education called IC Virginia, the interactive source for environmental education in Virginia. And it's going to be a GIS map where you can actually go and see all the environmental education opportunities in the state. So it's a huge undertaking, but it would be something where like Wolf Connection, so a teacher wanted to learn about wolves or something, Wolf Connection could actually show up on a California version of this, and any of your education initiatives could show up on that. Teachers will be able to search it by standards of learning and things. But the really big thing that we're working on that we were tasked with is creating a K through 12 environmental literacy strategic plan. And it's a huge undertaking. It is the first time that Virginia will have had one. I believe about 20, 25 other states have one right now. And, it was a really long process, but the goal with that will be to get the citizens of tomorrow ready to be environmental literate. So being able to make decisions for the prosperity of Virginia in terms of the environment and conservation and things like that. So really integrating environmental education into our public school sector from some very different veins of thinking than before. So that's what I've been up to. No biggie.
Just doing an entire state's worth of education. What types of...
No. There are a ton of other people involved in this.
Of course.
Our office is small. There's only 2 of us. But yeah, I mean, it is a very massive statewide initiative.
So what are the types of initiatives, or I'm trying to think of the word, what are the projects, or what are the things tangibly that people can look at or are going to be able to look at that are going to be integrated to make the next generations better stewards of conservation and looking at these things through the lenses that will help them be good stewards and conservationists going forward?
Yeah, what a phenomenal question. So I get to answer that by saying, I don't know. I'm not that smart. But I am smart enough to know that I don't know the answer to that question. So part of this process of developing initiatives and the strategic plan was bringing people smarter and experts in what they do to the table for this design, right? So the first 18 months in this job really has been assessing like the needs and goals there. So identifying target audiences. So we brought over, I think by the end, 91 different organizations representing NGOs, public businesses, tribal nations, different government agencies, all to the table to figure out what they needed. And some of the things that they decided, not Cassi, just to put that out there, right, were developing a network. So we have what's called the Virginia Environmental Literacy Network, which is really working towards getting people who are all working in this environmental ed and environmental literacy space together, getting them on the same page with things, and really making this a robust ecosystem within Virginia for people working together to define objectives a little more diplomatically across the board. And then I think through that, we have amazing partners everywhere from Department of Education, right? And they get to oversee things like designing curriculum. That's not something that we do in our space. And they're some of the best in the country who are doing that. And so the initiative, like the one initiative is that map that we talked about to serve as an actual resource. Besides that, I think that our big initiative is just to serve as kind of a lighthouse, is what I like to think, where we're this centralizing point, where we're this light in the fog that people can come and see what's happening. And you don't know what to do, but I know who to connect you with to get you to the right spot. And so there will be teachers and other organizations who are designing the things that will go into the classroom space. And I'm just here to help connect them to the right people and the right resources to get those things to happen.
Yeah, that sounds like a pretty big... It sounds good that you're bringing that all these different sections of people and departments are coming together to do that. Was there something missing in the curriculum with why it was disbanded 8 years ago, and then all of a sudden they said, no, we need to bring this sector back to, was there a need? Was there something that was voted on? Were there people that said, hey, we don't know enough about what's going on in Virginia environmentally? What was the reason for them to bring this stuff back?
I mean, luckily I was in over my head in Colorado at the time, so I can't speak to what was going on for disbanding or anything like that. But I do know that bringing it back was the work of some very loud and awesome stakeholders who knew that environmental education was a priority for the state of Virginia, and to make sure that Virginia is not left behind as the nation works towards some of those things. So to really get this office back to support environmental literacy growth over the next however long, to make sure that, ideally that we're not just maybe, we are kind of not put on a pedestal, that's not the right word, but that we're seen as maybe an example of what can happen when a whole state comes together working on things. So I think it was advocacy, right, from both nonprofit organizations and some government ones who had government backing to get this reinstated, so to speak, and which I think segues to the point of anybody listening, that is actually advocacy and work, right? So you think the things you care about are important. There are most likely other people that do too. Find them, connect with them, and you can also make big things happen.
Yep.
That's such an important point. And it's, you nailed it on the head, because there's so much, I think, that ties into, and actually I think this is another good segue. It's like you're segueing the entire podcast into the questions. But when you say that, because there have been some, I would say, big pieces of bills that are formulating in Washington. When we talk about the SAW Act, we talk about the Trinity Act. Senator Cory Booker did a huge social media post on Wolf Awareness Week talking about the Trinity Act in protecting bison, bears, and wolves. Do you feel, just in your space, because you're in this communication space, that the federal government is seeing these advocacy lanes and the way that people are starting to discuss them in a more measured and wanting to find a solution type way that these types of acts may actually come to fruition, get passed? Are they ready for that? What are you seeing on your end? Because you're in that area. So what do you see that's maybe shifting in Washington, if at all, if you can speak to it?
I don't work directly with Washington in any capacity. What I can say is that I think that from the work that I do, that yes, the voices of the public are absolutely considered in the decisions that we make and the strategies and objectives that are set forth to try and get those implemented. That said, obviously, not an entire population of people are going to feel like their thing is being worked on or even done the right way. So I do think the federal government has taken steps to address environmental challenges. And I do think that sustained public pressure and really strategic advocacy are needed and necessary to keep that momentum going. So things like that Cry for the Wild rally that you and me were both at, they do things like help build public support. But things like speaking directly to your members of Congress are critical in advancing legislation, right? When they see that many people show up to talk about things, you have to understand that the nuances of a human brain, the more somebody talks about something, we use the term saliency in research, right? So the more you hear about it, the more it's salient, which means it's an idea in your head that you can recall more quickly because it's readily available. So if you're just talking from a neurological aspect, of course it would be on their mind more when they've heard it repeated over and over and over. And so things like the SAW Act and the Trinity Act, both efforts are really public mobilization and direct advocacy, really highlight how those can work together to support environmental issues like wolf recovery and keep them as a national priority.
Yeah. And I noticed that when I was there, not to stick on Washington for too long, but you did see the openness of their staffs and people who, when you actually walk through the door and you come to them with, hey, we'd love to have these discussions and have these conversations, most of them are very open. I mean, the 5 or 6 doors that I walk through, and that seems to get lost sometimes, is that we are human and that people, it's like if you have just a normal conversation about, hey, these are the issues that are important to me. Is there someone I can be put in contact to? And most of the time, there's a staff member on these congressmen, senators, staffs that are able to be like, yeah, this is the person to talk to, and they can get you directed to that. So that seems as though it's like the lost art of talking to people as opposed to just getting in your zinger and kind of backing away.
You took it right out of my mouth. I think we forget that people who work in the government are humans. And often got into the field because they want to make a change, right? That is really, what a great first connector between people. You show up, you want to make change in the world. They took that job because they want to make change in the world. And how can you connect on that and build upon it? Because I promise the majority of them actually have good intentions.
Yeah.
That's a bold statement. Somebody's definitely going to hate that.
Nobody can imagine that would be true.
No, it's hard. It is hard.
No. And I mean, what does that say though? And I'll button up the Virginia thing for you, because it just, to me, it says that, like you say, there were enough voices and people that wanted to bring this conservation and recreation back so that it was implemented in the schools and in some way, shape, or form. So, I mean, this, to me, it shows there's a shifting of perception of biodiversity and environment and how important these things are. Because if it's in, what do you say, 25 other states or something, along with Virginia?
Around 20 or 25.
Right. So half the states in the country are implementing these types of initiatives. That's the word I'm looking for, right? So that to me seems like it's on the front of mind. It's neurologically there, as you were saying. It's salient, and people want to know about this stuff and have it for their kids and their kids' kids down the line.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So you talked about going to Europe, which I know some of it was over the summer, right? Around June or something like that. You were in the summer.
I was there 4 times this year since January.
Yeah. So you were all over the place. So
all over.
Yeah. And I want a huge shout out to you, though, for connecting Stephen and I with a lot of your international colleagues, friends. We've already had a couple of them on the podcast, and we have a couple more podcasts set up. So it's really good to have international voices, not only just for wolves, but also for large carnivores across the globe. But describe what that work with the European Union is, because that to me seems like an even more gigantic undertaking. Or maybe it's not, or it's fun. I don't know. What are those relationships like, and how did you get involved working for the European Union and being a part of these conferences and things of that sort?
So I got involved because I showed up at Wolves Across Borders and the International Wolf Symposium in 2022. And so even though I've been working in the wolf space for my whole life in some kind of capacity, I guess I showed up and said enough unique things in a unique enough kind of way that people are like, whoa, this lady's crazy. Let's bring her on. And I don't know why I just switched to a 1950s newspaper man, but yeah, come on, John, the report's out, get the news out, Cassie's on top. So I just got invited to the table for showing up. And that is one thing I think that also needs to go to other generations to really emphasize, showing up and networking and collaborations is really where stuff gets done. But I was thinking about how to describe the work in the EU to the primarily American audience here. And so I did actually take a couple notes. So I thought that I could give kind of a comparison of the federal government here and the European government there, because I think that will make some connections. Because saying I work for the European Union sounds really great, but guys, I work on 1% of one project on this massive scale. So the EU, just to give a little history lesson, has a couple different components. And one of that is what's called the European Commission. And the European Commission acts like the executive branch of the EU. So it proposes laws, it implements policies, and it ensures that the EU laws are followed by member states. So it also has, it's led by a president, so that's their leadership. And it's chosen by member states, so, members of the EU, and approved by the European Parliament. There are different commissioners and stuff, but we won't get into that, and they're appointed every 5 years. So underneath the commission, they have what's called the Directorates General, which is, so in slang, everybody calls them the DGs, okay? And so the DGs are like the departments or agencies in the US government, right? So we have the executive branch we just talked about, and then we've got these department or agencies. So the DGs could be like the Department of Education or the Environmental Protection Agencies. And so each DG focuses on a specific area like government, trade, energy, things like that. And so the vein in which I work is under the DG of the environment. And this DG handles policies specifically related to environmental protection and sustainability, very similar to the US EPA, Environmental Protection Agencies. So as an even further example, all right, you guys following me out there in the ethosphere? So we've got the EU Commission, we've got the Directorates General, and then in the Directorates General, there are different offices or divisions. So I work under the DG Environment has smaller division. One of those is Nature and Biodiversity. And so they're working specifically on protecting natural habitats and species. Under that, they have something called life projects. And those are specific initiatives that are funded by the European Union to support environmental and climate actions. So that's really comparable to government-funded projects in the US that are aimed at environmental protection, anything from wind energy or, the Federal Environmental Species Act.
Got it.
Cool. That was a lot. I wish this was visual so I could like draw a diagram for people. So just to recap, you've got the EU, right? It's got all these countries. Then you've got the European Commission. Then you have your directorates general. Then you have different offices like nature and biodiversity. And then your money comes from things like life projects. I work on a life project that's human carnivore coexistence. And there's it's across, I believe, 13 different countries. And there is a massive part in this one about youth engagement. And so I was hired on as a consultant for this one component. So looking at some of the strategies and objectives that they do. And it is similar to the US. Outside organizations bid on these to become the representatives. And this one is handled by a group called Adelphi out of Germany, which has some incredible staff members that I work with. So I work directly with them. They pay me. I look at some of their education initiatives. We brainstorm, look at documents, bing, bang, boom. Whew, that's a lot.
So
you guys follow that?
I got it. Yeah. I don't know.
So what about their, what about their, since we're on the topic of, or at least we were on the topic of educating and sort of communicating these kinds of difficult wildlife issues to the public, do they have a different approach that you've noticed in a meaningful way or different priorities?
I would say the reason I got invited to the table is because there's not a lot of us who are specific in the carnivore communication youth lane. If there's more of you out there who are listening to this, please email me because I know of 3 of us and I want to talk to you. Obviously, there are people who are doing programming and stuff. I'm more talking about this like research strategic level type of thing. And so I do think that their approach is a little different, right? They do have this, what at least from the outside to me, and they might, ask some of the other people you're going to interview that I connected you with. But from the outside looking in, I feel like it is a much more cooperative and transnational approach that we just don't have here in North America. So I think it lends itself to the fact that obviously carnivores roam across borders, right? That's just not a thing. And so when you're trying to promote habitat connectivity and carnivore populations across multiple countries, I think you're forced into that lane. And it does feel different when you have funding specifically to work on cross-border collaboration, right? When people are giving you millions of dollars to figure out how to work with your neighboring countries, you're going to do it in some capacity versus some of the approach here is often at the state level, right? We do have those federal protections, but things like the reintroduction stuff, those in Yellowstone happen at the national levels, but certain regions, where they get delisted at their state level, and then the state starts to monitor hunting and management populations. And then if we are going to talk about education and things, we're going to talk about it at the state level, not this transnational one. And I think there's benefits to both. I think when you're talking about communication, I think the transnational approach lends itself to having more collaborators and more brains at the table, which I don't think I think that's always a good 100%. Thing. When you're talking about communication to a specific population, obviously one shoe does not fit all if you're talking about 13 countries in the European Union or 50 states in the United States. And if you're looking at a youth population in rural Colorado or an inner city population in Northern Virginia, the way I talk to each of those groups of kids about carnivore coexistence or environmental education, it needs to be tailored to the specificity and the nuances that those regions and communities that are specific to them. And so I think I like the collaborative kind of EU approach. And then I think that they do a good job understanding that those nuances need to happen. So it's like, hey, let's have these big ideas. And then we kind of funnel down to the specifications. And I don't know if the US just hasn't figured it out, or if because the history in our country of having state rights is so innate into who we are as citizens of the world, that just doesn't lend itself to something that Americans want.
So what about, we were talking before about in Colorado about how there's been some challenge with local governments sort of listening to all the groups or bringing every group's perspective to the table. What about how in the EU they address things like compromise or listening to groups like you were saying who disagree and how they integrate different perspectives on a public level, since you covered the transnationalism, but on a public level, do you feel like there's a different approach there as well? Or
I think I'm supposed to answer this differently, but obviously I don't know how to not tell the truth. So I think they do it better. And I don't know if that's just because everybody I've met with I like so much, and that maybe the populations of people in those areas would really firmly disagree with that. So I would challenge you to ask the other people you're going to interview. I know you talked to Daniel a little bit about that. I think my friends from Finland and Italy can definitely have some more and better insight than I do. I think they have similar challenges, right? There are people who hate wolves. There are people who love wolves. Wolves are definitely a symbol of animosity in some aspects, very similar to here because of the same stories that were told and things like that, right? The stories that we tell here in America came from Europe,
right?
When that migration happened. But I think, at least from the outside again, what it seems like is everybody's at least willing to come to the table in the first place. And that doesn't feel like that happens here. I think people show up at the table, but I don't think it comes with this like innate willingness to be there from the get-go. And I don't know where that comes from. And I don't know if it's right. Like, I don't know if that is just how my outside view kind of sees it. So I'm not sure.
Okay. Well, as an extension of that, I'm just curious, what do you think about the concept of compromise? Like, what does it really mean to you in this case and in Wildlife Matters? Is it important to consider a genuine compromise? Because this comes up a lot, and we've had listeners comment on it as well, which is in the context of Colorado wolf reintroduction. The idea is that ranchers who live with wolves can't take lethal action when a wolf is or when they're in long-term conflict with an individual wolf, and that in some way compromise would be that ranchers could take that action because that's what they're asking for. And then the argument is there's no scientific basis for whether that even works. And in fact, it might exacerbate issues with wolves and destabilize packs and all these things. So it's like where compromise and science sometimes don't agree. How do you navigate that in terms of communicating and in terms of educating? I mean, what do you think about that issue?
I think that no real solution isn't compromise on both parties' accounts. I think if you walk away with nobody being 100% happy, then you probably have a decent answer to a question or the problem you're solving. Right. And I don't think that that's what most people want to do. You don't want to walk out of a room going, I didn't get my way. Oh, that's a bad decision. But in facilitation work, like that's where the sweet spot is. That is where Karen Vardaman from Working Circle calls it the radical middle, right? That is where the radical middle space exists. And I think that's where we have to live. And part of the problem is convincing people that that's a benefit for them. And I think it's a really nuanced thing, because what might convince one farmer or rancher to compromise on something might be very different than another one. Or from a different community, from a different ethnic background, from a different socioeconomic background, right? Like you might be more concerned with keeping a roof over your head versus these other things. And I think all of that has to come to the table. And I think I'm rambling without actually answering your question, because obviously I've learned how to be a politician.
No, and I think you did answer it. And the idea is that if we all leave with something we can live with and also some mild disappointment, then it's a good sign that we compromise. Because we also forget that even though we agree with these particular scientific findings that we do, there may be folks that don't, or that don't trust it, or that listen to different sources that they trust more telling them something else. And I don't think any of us would like to be forced to do something or not do something based on a finding we didn't even agree was based in reality from a source we didn't trust, for that matter. And that's not compromise. So I think in this case, it might be hard to accept, and that the real compromise or collaboration we like to talk about would be would be uncomfortable.
And if we talk about the science specifically, a lot of what it says is that doesn't shift your value systems or your later behavior. That doesn't mean it doesn't change some slight other shift in terms of how you act with other people socially, right? Maybe even it's this slight willingness to listen to somebody else on the other side. And again, it's not a one size fits all. Like, you letting me shoot a wolf isn't going to change my behavior around the topic. It's probably not going to change somebody else's, but maybe it means when I knock on their door because a wolf pack is there that they might let me in. Right. And that, I mean, and it's tiny things that are really, really difficult to measure in a scientific capacity. And yeah, just back to the other point, I think as long as everybody's slightly upset, you're on the right path.
Well, because you brought up Daniel, and it really was an interesting conversation with him. And then I we did a podcast with Cecilia Di Bernardi, who is from Italy, but is now working in Sweden, and just understanding those dynamics and those relationships, like you said. I mean, spoiler alert for the one because their episode's not out yet, but the conversations that happen that Daniel was telling us that he's had, the conversations that Cecilia has had, being from another country and understanding the culture of Sweden and understanding about the hunts and the way management is different from science, and it's two different things. It really does open the door to understanding how a lot of these countries get along, and understanding, like you were saying, Cassie, that animals traverse across borders. It's going from one country to another, not just a state. So it's completely different, but they're following this EU thing. Is anything being done differently in terms of the conversation aspect or the communication aspect? Or, like you say, is it just the fact that folks are coming to the table with compromise possibly in mind as opposed to not? I don't know, but like, does this go along with like what happened at the Life event? Because I was scrolling through your Instagram and seeing that, and those are tough conversations to have, but it seems as though they're willing to have them.
Yeah. So as John just mentioned, so one of the things I did this summer was attend the Life Project for Wolf Alps, and it was their like final progress report thing. And I will just highlight that they do things differently. They had a small conference for everybody who was involved on that project, and they celebrated wins. I don't think that's a thing that we stop and do in this country. We don't get together to talk about the barriers, the pitfalls, let alone the benefits of what came out of this, even if we didn't reach our goal, right? And so to sit in a room with people from other countries who had all participated on this in some capacity, and I was there just to kind of figure out what this EU context was, I mean, that is freaking refreshing of just like, yeah, this is what we did. This one didn't work at all. This one was hugely successful. And so I think just the way they approach some of the things are really different. And then on the EU scale, right, if you're trying to come up with communication plans, I know that the people that I've worked with, part of the conversation is, how do we create a youth engagement and outreach plan on a massive scale that then each of these countries can adapt locally and on a nuanced base. And I don't know of any initiatives specifically in the wolf field on a national level in the United States that do that try to promote this thing nationally, and then have the resources for you on a state level or even smaller local level to adapt them.
It seems as though too, and I don't know if we're spinning our wheels here or doing whatever. It seems like we always get in these conversations, but when we're talking about things that get lost in the shuffle or the conversation in this country, and we are by no means, I'm sure we'll get some flack. We're not saying that, this country doesn't have people who are willing to come to the table and do all these things. Like, just hopefully people understand that, but I'm sure we'll get some flack. It's just, I think, going and seeing what other places are doing differently. And there is still, you know, I mean, it was said in both the podcasts that we did internationally with Daniel and with Cecilia, right? There are hunting cultures. So they do hunt ungulates. They do hunt carnivores. It just seems as though there's a quota. It is what it is, and it does that. I'm not promoting hunting of carnivores here. We're in a different situation, obviously. All countries, all states, everything is in a different place. But to your point, Cassie, like when you're looking at the life event, is there a sense of like humbleness that comes with that, with people understanding, hey, there are some things we can always do better, and taking that? Is there a lot of cross information happening from different countries where they're saying, we're at this event, this is things we did wrong, what did this country do better that we can take with us? Is there a lot of that happening?
Yeah, and I don't think it's personal, right? It's not, oh, we did this wrong and they did it better than us. It's oh, wow, our colleagues did this amazing thing. How can we adapt what we're doing in tandem with that, right? So it's not this like negative rhetoric. But I mean, just to go back to one of the things you said, yeah, there's these massive hunting cultures and things like that in certain of these countries. In the US, we are shifting out of that. There's only about, I believe the last statistic I read, it's only like 6% or 7% of Americans identify as hunters. And that might just be numbers of who is registered as a hunter. So it could be larger than that. And the percentages in some of these other countries are still substantially higher. So you are dealing with different groups who have different value systems, who think about these things in a different way. And I think that when you're having to do that on the daily, and that's the population that you maybe have to cater to, that it does allow you to see that your collaborators or people in neighboring states might be able to bring something to the table that you're not. And I don't know if that's an American like issue, in that we typically are very independent, right? We like to think independently. We like to think that, you know, we are top notch and doing the best ourselves, or are the best. I think that's innate characteristics of Americans. So I don't know.
Yeah. Why, shifting just from the life event for a moment, because you touched on wolves across borders, and you were there. Like tell everyone the difference between the life event. Seems as though it was coming, like you said, sort of a rehashing of what went well and what didn't. Wolves across borders, is that similar to the International Wolf Symposium that we were at in Minnesota?
The International Wolf Symposium. They cross promote each other, so it is the same thing, but over there. And ideally, right, getting a different population of people to come, making it a little more accessible, that they don't have to fly to North America and Minnesota every year or whenever. So yes, and the last one had focused on literally the theme was across borders, and I can't remember what this next year's is, but everybody should look it up and think about coming. So it is called Wolves Across Borders. They're focusing on ecology and management, and we're going to be in Amsterdam. And if you liked anything I said here today, come, because I'm doing a workshop and a presentation. Woo!
And getting 2 new jobs.
My God, I would. Who doesn't need 7 jobs? Why not?
Yeah, exactly.
100%. No, I'm graduating in 18 months with my PhD. That is my number one priority. And then we'll see where I am.
Okay.
Hopefully my boss doesn't listen to this podcast. I'm like, oh, clearly. Cool. She's got 18 months left.
He's actually our number 1 listener. He always
man, cool. Yeah. I would say his name, but he would be furious.
He's listening to this live stream right now.
He's actually on Zoom. Listening. He's blind. He's a blind Zoom associate.
Hey, DG.
What does this all give you? Because to me, you're very lucky to go into all these different, not just the different countries, but so many different groups of people. What is this like for you to be able to have all these perspectives and be able to impart the wisdom and the knowledge that you've gained, not domestically? Because that to me is huge, that you have an international perspective, you have a domestic perspective. How are you able to meld all that stuff together, or are you melding some of that stuff together when you look at, Virginia Department of Conservation and Recreation Is that part of your thought process when you go through all this stuff?
Oh, for sure. I think all of it lends itself to collaborate inside of my brain in a very particular way. And I do think I'm lucky. I told somebody the other day I don't dream anymore because I'm living it. That's a pretty good line, right? Yeah, you're welcome.
That needs to be my excuse too. I don't dream anymore either.
Yeah,
That's why.
I don't dream because every day
Wow, that's
I'm
why.
living.
I didn't know that. That's why.
Yeah, there you go.
Wow.
But yeah, I mean, I definitely think I bring things back. I obviously one work is very specific to wolves, but obviously my niche in there falls to the communication lens and working with youth. And I think they all continually challenge me to figure out better ways to communicate with the stakeholders and the members involved in the projects that I work on. Everything from, localized messaging to community engagements to international agreements and cooperations to conflict mitigation strategies. What does that look like over there? How can that transpond over here? Is that something that I need to consider for working with tribal nations in this country? Is that the same how they would consider working with indigenous populations in Europe? How does polarization, some of these topics, while they are very specific in and of themselves, they're cross-topical, right? Polarization happens with wolves. It happens with environmental education. It happens with most anything. There's political or economic bias that happen in all of these arenas that I work in, cultural and emotional barriers, right? And I think that is the intersection. If we were thinking of it as like a Venn diagram from my 7 jobs, that intersection in the middle is really learning more about myself, about how I engage with people, and continuing allowing myself to be challenged to figure out ways to diminish those barriers and those biases and bring people with those polarizing ideas and values to the table together.
When you talk about indigenous people here, and then you talk about native people over in Europe, are you seeing a lot of the same, I guess I hate bringing to the table, I'll just say it that way. Are you seeing that there's more inclusion? That's the word I'm looking for again. Are you seeing more inclusion of those populaces?
No, that's something we all suck at. Globally, we do not do enough to bring in those populations of people, and particularly to decrease the barriers to get them to the table, right? There are marginalized communities all over the globe, and we don't often remember that inviting them to the table is not usually enough, but to decrease any of the barriers that come with that, including, social fear of being in a room with a government agent, right? That made me sound like a spy, which I'm not. But if your entire community was treated a certain way by the government, and then somebody walks in representing that, those are things you have to think about. And I don't think people are thinking about some of that cultural sensitivity as well as the financial barriers when they're not there. So no, we all could do better in that realm.
Yeah.
And you should, because they bring the right ideas and beautiful ways of thinking about these topics.
Yeah, it really seems that.
Yeah, 100%.
No,
we've said that a
I
bunch
agree,
of times.
Stephen. I don't mean to cut you off.
And experienced it.
Yeah, I mean, I second that. It's or third it, because we all believe it. I think that there's this lost way of looking at things, and I don't pretend to be, someone of indigenous descent or anything in that matter. But when you work in the wildlife space for any degree of time, and you see that there's multiple different ways to think about these things, and you're leaving out probably the most natural way of thinking and doing it, you're definitely losing a key piece of the puzzle for both, not just conservation because of the way things have gone throughout history, but the biodiversity aspect of how everything, we're starting to really dive into that with this podcast as we move forward. It's just about biodiversity. And Stephen's brought that to the table a lot. It's just, we are losing the things that, that make the world tick. And the more things that stuff sort of clicks off, we're like, oh, we lost another species, we lost another plant. It's like, how is anything going to survive? if we don't listen to the stuff that the people that came before us in doing this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a word I actually don't like to use often. So we'll just go on a tangent for a quick second.
Sure.
Because I primarily work with youth populations, you also need to remember that people in this country, on average, have a 10th grade or lower reading ability and reading comprehension ability, right? So they might be able to read, but comprehending certain things. And imagine, this is one of the things that happened in Colorado, right? The ballot initiative had the word biodiversity, or a lot of the rhetoric in the media had the word biodiversity around it. And imagine if you don't have any idea what that word means. Like, what is biodiversity? Can you actually define that on the spot, right? And so I think figuring out different ways to meet people where they're at. So explaining things like biodiversity as, genetic diversity, species diversity, ecosystem diversity, and the variety and richness of life on Earth, instead of these large conceptual things that I don't think the major public can actually wrap their head around.
No, but that's why you have the expertise in the communication space, because you're seeing this from a global perspective. And so that's why it's so informative to have you on to understand these things. And it's true. There's very few folks. Well, there's very few people that can say you went to a life event, run, or dealt with the EU and are helping a department here in the state of Virginia to create, again, this conservation and stewardship in the classroom, along with 24 other states, including the state that you work with right now. So it's a valuable perspective to have. That, I don't know. I guess one of my last questions, I guess, for you is: do you feel globally, and I guess in Virginia particularly, because that's where you're working right now, that there is a conscious effort to shift, let alone not that they brought the department back, there is a conscious shift to recognize the environmental situation we're in right now, and that it's important for those to understand, the younger generation to understand like what's happening and how to save it or work with it?
Wolf, what a question, John. And way to ask me that the day before Election Day.
Sorry.
No, it's good. Yes and no. I think I'm going to focus on the things that I do know. I know that we have statistically seen a shift from millennials, Gen Z, and Gen Alpha in percentage-wise that we can actually track, that show massive concern for the environment, the species that we're losing, everything from recycling to fashion waste, while simultaneously seeing those things increase, right? Pollution, pounds and pounds of clothes in the dump and things like that, seeing them increase. We also statistically know that at no other time in U.S. history that we've just created new medical diagnoses because of millennials and Gen Z, and that the amount of people who are being prescribed anxiety and depression drugs that are being labeled as eco-anxiety or eco-depression is like astronomical right now. It is one of the primary causes of new anxiety patients. And so I think just acknowledging some of those numbers and how that even intersects with the medical and health field, you can see that correlation between people thinking about it being on their minds, and they're being worried about it. I see the biggest barrier for the future is people letting those feelings of depression and anxiety stop us from making positive action. And my God, is that going to be hard to do? But if anybody can do it, we can live on this really positive note. If anybody can do it, I do think it's Gen Z. They get a bad rep. But if that's on your mind all the time and you don't think there's going to be a world left for you to live on, action is one of the only answers. And I think we're seeing increased engagement across the board. But that would be a whole different podcast to go into those numbers. So yeah, I think the tide is shifting. The question is, will it shift too late? I would like to say I'm in Jane Goodall's camp of, I think hope is the answer. And without hope, we're doomed. So keep hoping. Don't forget to make compromise. And we can change the world together.
Shit, right.
Dun, dun, dun.
Oh my God, that's funny.
Let's skip the outro and just end it right there.
Yeah, thanks for leaving us on a positive note. I think it's tough to get lost in the stuff, and it's always good to leave that there is a positive angle for all this. Where can people go to see or know about Wolves Across Borders? I'm sure I know their website's up because I've been looking, and yes, I have been possibly thinking about making a trip there.
Well, you can fly on a plane with me because I will also be there. Yeah, where can people find me?
Like what's like if they want to get involved with the stuff domestically you're doing with Virginia Department of Conservation and Recreation, is there a way to get to you to get involved with what you're talking about? Get to the lighthouse.
Do we post my email in the thing? You can post my email. Here, I'm just going to put it out there. Here we go. cassi.camara@dcr.virginia.gov. I'd love to hear from you, unless you hated this podcast, and then please don't email me.
Is that the new Alexa voice?
It should be. I don't know. Voices, I guess, is the thing I try to do. If you want to learn about Wolves Across Borders and things happening on a global scale, you can go to wolvesacrossborders.com. If you want to hear about any of the interesting things happening in Colorado, you should Google, because it is too long of a website, the Center for Human Carnivore Coexistence on Google, and we should pop right up. I think that's 3 out of my things. That's good. I'm not going to give you my social media tags because I don't like them. So there we go.
Fair enough. Oh my God. You literally always just make us laugh. It's really great to talk to you always. You're a wealth of information. We really just, we enjoy talking to you, and thanks for your candid and honest perspectives on things. It's really, it's a lot more of what we need, and what hopefully people take away from this is just you're hilarious and you're awesome.
Well,
so hopefully people
thank you. You guys aren't so bad yourself. And if you guys can't see this live, they're both pretty cute. Oh God, how do I sign off now?
How do I sign off? Oh my God, please stick on with us, Cassie, while we sign off. Anyway, thanks so much. How's to y'all out there?
How's to you?
We'll talk to you guys later. Looking for more information about Wolf Connection or the podcast? Please visit our website at wolfconnection.org, where you can donate, sponsor a wolf, or become a volunteer.